Good evening and welcome to Fourth Presbyterian Church. We are glad that you are here this evening. My name is Reverend Tom R. I'm one of the pastors here, and it is my privilege to welcome you to this Michigan Avenue Forum. Fourth Church recognizes that healthy communities need public space to engage matters of importance thoughtfully and respectfully, in an effort to promote good citizenship. And sadly, in our current culture, those kinds of spaces are not in an abundance. And so we have a longstanding practice of trying to be such a place in this community, and Michigan Avenue Forum seeks to provide just such a space. So we thank you for your presence here, whether you are here in the sanctuary or whether you are joining us online from places near or far. We are delighted that you've chosen to be here. You are here to benefit from our speaker, Robert P. Jones, who will be introduced in just a moment. But first, let me invite you to welcome Fourth Church member and really leader in our congregation, Cynthia Johnson. Cynthia, thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and as Tom mentioned, I'm Cynthia Johnson. I'm a member of the Michigan Avenue Forum, and I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone in the sanctuary this evening, as well as the folks who are with us viewing tonight's session online. I just wanted to mention that we will be encouraging questions, so as you listen to Robbie speak, please consider jotting your thoughts down on the question cards that our ushers have. They will bring the cards up to one of my committee members, and we will address as many questions as possible at the end of the program. So I am honored to introduce Robert P. Jones. We are fondly referring to him as Robbie, as our speaker for this evening's program. He is the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, and as you all know, he is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. He regularly writes columns on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic magazine, Time, Religion News Service, and many other publications as well. He's frequently featured in major national media such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many others. In addition to his writing, he has really brought to the forefront the concepts about truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in America, Christianity. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Did I get that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Additionally, Robbie has a Chicago connection to our community. And before you start with your comments, why don't you share a little bit about your Chicago connection?
Sure. Well, first I want to take credit for bringing the mild weather from D.C. Over to here. Yes, so my in-laws are from Chicago. So my wife grew up in Evanston. Her father grew up on the south side of Chicago, so I'm here a lot, actually. They're still here.
Well, welcome. Thank you for the mild weather. We appreciate that, especially after the last few weeks.
Great.
So I know that you have some prepared comments that you will share before I go through a list of questions that I'd like you to respond to. So why don't you go ahead and get started?
Great. Well, I'm going to take about 30 minutes, I think, to set the table a bit, and then we're going to have a conversation for about 30 minutes after that, and then we'll take some questions as well and hopefully answer some things that you have on your mind as well. I'm going to jump right in, and the book basically has two parts to it. It's reflected in the long title, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, kind of as part one, and then the other part of it is and the path to a shared American future. My opening remarks, I'm going to concentrate on that first part, the hidden roots of white supremacy and sort of lay that out a bit, and we can talk maybe more about the second half, second part of the book in our comments. But I'm going to begin with something of a confession, just jumping right in, of what kind of I feel like far too many white people and too many conservative white Christians in particular are seeming to claim today. And I kind of write about this at the end of the book and do my best to just channel what I'm hearing if people were saying the quiet part out loud. Now, increasingly, people are saying the quiet part out loud, but I try to kind of do it as forcefully as I can. So I'm going to start with just this reading from the last chapter of the book to kind of give you a flavor of that. I think it'll also set the table for this kind of longer, bigger conversation when I have. So the following is my attempt to give voice to the half-conscious narrative I inherited and relied upon for far too many years to dispel the ghosts of other American histories haunting the edges of my awareness. And I believe it's not too far off the mark from the history many contemporary white Christians are demanding at this moment, or at least the history we actually want to claim, even if we cannot bring ourselves to assert it as straightforwardly as our forebears. So, we white Christian people would like to hold these truths to be self-evident. That we bear no responsibility for the actions of our ancestors, nor for the effects of their actions on the present. That hard work and individual merit are the keys to understanding both the path to the present and the possibilities of the future. The haves and the have-nots today receive what they deserve based on the virtues of their individual past actions. It follows that no one, particularly hardworking white Christian people, should be made to feel uncomfortable because of what we now have. If anyone asserts otherwise, we are the ones being discriminated against. This land is our land, from California to the New York Island. We deserve to keep everything we worked so hard to take. We have deeds and safe deposit boxes with our names on them, the veracity of which are guaranteed by a notary seal and a state we created for this purpose. As for the vast amount of wealth locked away in individual trusts and institutional endowments, we have histories that document our industriousness and our cunning, along with quarterly and annual statements that testify to our now long-held legal ownership. Furthermore, what we have done with the ultimate authority. Jesus is one of us. In case there was any doubt, we made a likeness of Jesus in our image the most widely distributed portrait in human history. We insist, both for ourselves and for others, on an inevitable present, one in which what was leads to what is, and what is will always be. Now, it's not that we're against history. We know the importance of a good origin story. History, done rightly, explains how we got here, with our fences transforming land into property, our ledgers turning labor and crops into capital, and our hands holding the receipts. The history of America, founded in 1776, is a Genesis story justifying the divinely ordained now, not a sloppy mess of narratives with multiple beginnings and contingent outcomes. Those who look like us own the publishing companies who hired our writers to tell us the story of how we became America. Those executives also had the right connections to sell those packaged narratives to our public school boards, who handed books and lesson plans to our teachers, who in turn faithfully taught these stories to our children. And the circle remained unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by. We know that slavery was a blemish on this country's record, and that it was mostly the cause of the Civil War. Still, there were good and noble people fighting on both sides. Even though slavery wasn't as brutal as Hollywood depicts it, we're glad that sinful practice has ended and that the whole unfortunate episode is behind us now. What we didn't get right after the Civil War was finally rectified by the good Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., whose eloquent words we now read in our churches and whose birthday we celebrate alongside Robert E. Lee's. On the occasion when we think about it, we also feel bad about what happened to the Indians. But we also share Laura Ingalls Wilder's sentiments about the land in the early days of the country. Quote, "There were no people there, only Indians lived there." End quote. In any case, we weren't personally part of all that. And it was, after all, our missionaries who brought the Indians with their primitive and savage ways out of the darkness and into the light of Christian salvation. It was our government and our churches that coaxed those lost children out of the woods and into boarding schools, saving their souls and disciplining their bodies for more industrious pursuits like farming and factory work. We still honor their history with our athletic team names, mascots, and more recently, with the occasional land acknowledgement ritual at public events. We did finally give the Indians reservations of their own, and they seem to be doing fine now with their casinos and government-provided health care. Finally, though of course there have been times when some Christians acted badly. They were acting against and not with the spirit of our faith. No true Christian would kill or steal or lie. This is the history we want our tax dollars to teach public school children, and many of our children are already getting this history in private Christian academies. We want our children to know that America is good, just like us. So that was my best attempt at channeling what I think I'm hearing so often in the news, in debates, and trying to kind of unravel and get to the bottom of that as part of what my writing and research has been about. Now, if like me, you're someone who grew up thinking of yourself as white and identifying as Christian, this may sit somewhat uncomfortably to you. There's a bunch of D words that have come to mind, I think, when I'm talking to predominantly white audiences in particular, things like a sense of disequilibrium, dismay, discomfort, defensiveness, right? And the sense of kind of wanting to distance oneself from this narrative. Let me just encourage you, again, if that's kind of your background tonight, you just kind of hold all that together. I've been doing a lot of this, just trying to kind of hold the gaze, right? Not look away, hold the gaze, hold the feelings, and kind of think them through as we kind of have a conversation tonight. Because we'll be wrestling with some troubling history that raises challenging questions for us in the present. So one way of understanding this latest book is an attempt to understand America's identity crisis and to clearly identify the worldview that I think is at the root of this crisis. Now, many of you have read the book, but for those of you who haven't, a little spoiler alert, I've really come to the conclusion that the foundation of this problematic worldview that's causing us still so much strife in the country today comes directly from a dominant version of Christianity that landed on these shores from Europe. And it's one that still holds a claim on us today. That we basically inherited a deep disorder in predominantly white Christianity, and it has made us unwell. I'm going to read you just a short quote from James Baldwin, who I think had his finger on this some time ago. When he was asked to describe kind of the state of kind of how African Americans thought about white people, this is what he said. This is from The Fire Next Time. Negroes know far more about white Americans than that. It can almost be said, in fact, that they know about white Americans what parents, or anyway mothers, know about their children, and that they very often regard white Americans that way. And perhaps this attitude, held in spite of what they know and have endured, helps explain why Negroes on the whole and until lately have allowed themselves to feel so little hatred. Here's the line. The tendency has really been, insofar as this was possible, to dismiss white people as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. Right? To dismiss white people as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. And I think he's really onto something there. We kind of think about that narrative I just read and what's going on. But now, before I go too much further, I do want to kind of be clear here that, I grew up someone thinking of myself as white, identifying as Christian. So these things are not just something I'm approaching as a scholar, but they're deeply personal to me. So I grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi. I went to a Southern Baptist college, Mississippi College. I went to a Southern Baptist seminary where I received a Master of Divinity degree from the Southern Baptist Seminary in Texas. So these are things that are deeply, deeply personal to me. And in many ways, it's really been the sense of my trying to unravel where my faith began and how it was entangled in white supremacy from the beginning. So how do I disentangle these two things? I'm 3 books in to answering that question and still wrestling with it. And one way to kind of understand where I'm at is just a quick overview of kind of the last, not overview, but like a really quick thing about how I've been on this journey through these last three books. So in 2016, I wrote a book called The End of White Christian America. That book was really about what is going on. And essentially, if I could put it colloquially, how can we understand what I've kind of only half-jokingly called the Great White Christian Freakout that we've been experiencing in this country? What is happening, right? QAnon, conspiracy theories, like just things that are just inexplicable in many ways. How do we understand all this? And there I looked at kind of a sea change in the country. And I think this is part of what has led to this moment, really, of anomie, is one way to kind of borrow a sociologist's term, disorientation among many conservative white Christians. And it is that the country has been changing around them in ways that they really thought were not possible. And basically what's happened is that we have gone just in the last 20 years from being a majority white Christian country to one that is no longer a majority white Christian country. Just 20 years ago, the country was 54% white and Christian. If you took all people who were white, non-Hispanic and Christian, Catholic, Protestant, non-denominational, what have you, 54% white and Christian. That number today is 42% white and Christian. That's a lot of demographic change in a very short amount of time. And I think as many white Christian people have found themselves kind of no longer at the kind of top of the cultural and political power pyramid and decentered really from the cultural story, that has been part of what's going on. The book I wrote in 2020 was called White Too Long, The Legacy of of White Supremacy in American Christianity. That was really a book of memoir. I was really trying to sort out, like, so how does this sort out, using kind of sociology and memoir, how does this sort itself out in my own family's story? So I would go back, my family's 6 generations back, and lived basically in one of 2 counties in middle Georgia, either Twiggs County or Bibb County, Georgia, around Macon. Lots of Baptist preachers all the way back, and so this is very, very deep in my DNA, trying to sort that out, and how does this kind of come up with us through us today? And really seeing, even through my own family story and through the numbers today, even in public opinion surveys, it disturbingly showed that there is that a defining characteristic of white Christianity today, not just white evangelical Christianity, but white mainline, the kind of non-evangelical world, and white Catholics as well, a defining characteristic was a denial of the existence of systemic racism and holding racist views. Right? Even controlling for party and race and all kinds of things, that is deep, deep in the DNA of white Christianity. And so this book really, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, is kind of saying, okay, well, where does this come from? And so I'm trying to trace it all the way back as far as I can go, at least to the kind of proximate cause as it lands on these shores that affects most directly our history. So I'm going to say just a couple of words about that, because that has really been kind of the kind of defining question of this book. And I came to describe in the opening chapters of this book something called the Christian doctrine of discovery. Now, I've got a PhD in religion. I've taken any number of history courses, and it may have been mentioned somewhere, but nowhere did I really get the sense that this thing called the doctrine of discovery was key to understanding kind of our current cultural situation. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what that is. So this is a set of papal doctrines that were issued between 1452 and 1493. So 15th century, way back there. Now, what's going on in that period? They were essentially a question posed to the church by the political leaders, kings in Western Europe, to deal with a political opportunity and a theological crisis. And that was the quote-unquote discovery of these people and a whole continent that existed that there was no knowledge of, right, up until that point. So it's this kind of quote-unquote age of discovery from the perspective of Western Europe. And it really comes down to this. The real moral question that was connected, of course, to the political opportunism was, what rights do these people have, right, that we had no idea existed? how do we map them onto our Christian worldview? What is our relationship vis-a-vis them? And after a lot of kind of theological gymnastics, the answer came back, and they put the question to the highest authority that there was in Western Europe at that time, and that was the Pope in Rome. So now I know there's probably a lot of Protestants in this room, maybe not so many Catholics, unless you're starting to feel smug about this. This is before the Protestant Reformation, right? There are no Protestants in the world. If you're Anglican and you're feeling a little smug, this is before the break with the Church of England. So there are no Anglicans in the world, right? This is all of Western Europe is Catholic at this time. And so this is the closest thing to international law that exists. That's why the appeal goes to the Pope. So what they were asking for, right, is they knew what they wanted to do politically, and that was conquest and colonization, and they needed a moral mandate for what they were able to do, moral permission, what they were about to do, and that's what they turned to the church to get. And that's what these series of papal bulls that were issued were all about addressing. And essentially they answered the question of what rights these people have with a question of their own. And so the kind of threshold question was, well, are they Christian? Now, of course, they knew the answer to that question. Of course, they were not Christian. But then the logic just fell out. Well, if they're not Christian, then you have the right to take their land, to steal their goods, to occupy the territory in the name of the political leaders, and then spelled it out like in the documents, and to submit their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? So it gives permission for violence and perpetual slavery right there directly from the church. And this, of course, sets off the entire colonial project. The one that's the most relevant for us is 1493, which was issued precisely in response to Columbus's voyage the year before. So if we're thinking about our children learning that little rhyme, like in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The one we really need to be learning is something about, I've been thinking about making one up, but I haven't come up with a good one yet. But something about 1493, because that's actually what sets us on the moral and religious course that we have been on ever since. And one way of kind of thinking about this is that to kind of see this, now this sounds like way far away and way back there, 15th century, right? So 500 years ago, but yet we can see it coming down through kind of our laws, through our founding documents. I'm gonna give you just a couple of examples. So the Declaration of Independence, how does the doctrine of discovery, this idea that the U.S., that the Americas, not just America, but the Americas, were set aside by God as a kind of promised land for European Christians. That's what it really comes down to, right? So where do we see that showing up? So it shows up actually in the Declaration of Independence. Now, we don't think about that much, but among the grievances that are listed in the Declaration of Independence is this. He, again, he is the king. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Right, so that first part, domestic insurrections, is a reference to slave rebellions, right? They're mad at the king for inciting slave rebellions, and then they have this line about merciless Indian savages. So this idea, right, of European Christian superiority built right there into the Declaration of Independence. In the Constitution, you can't get to Section 2 without seeing that Indians are excluded, specifically excluded from rights, and enslaved people are counted, right, notoriously, as 3/5 of a person, but then only to increase the power of their enslavers, right, not counted on their own behalf. It actually comes into U.S. Supreme Court law in a case called Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, and Chief Justice John Marshall says this: "The character and religion of the New World's inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. The potentates of the Old World found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the New by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity." Right? So this kind of sense that this was the trade. We give you Christianity, but we take all your stuff, right? And that's the kind of logic of the doctrine of discovery. It's also kind of embedded in our cultural practices, right, that we see all the time, all the way up into the 20th centuries. redlining, right? Chicago, right? We're here. I'm from Georgia in the South, so y'all ain't got nothing on us, right? On kind of implementing the doctrine of discovery. But Chicago, right? One of the most segregated cities still today in the country. That's a direct legacy of this idea, right? That the best things, right, in society, whether it's pools and parks, libraries, schools, were reserved for good white Christian people. That is who the country was for, right? And everyone else, whether you're Native American, African American, Latino, anyone else is sort of second-class citizens. And that really was, I think, the sort of shocking things all along that has been undergirded by Christian theology, right? It is a Christian theological claim at its roots. That is what always has given it kind of its moral force. Now, I'd like to say more about that when we talk, but I want to kind of just close with a couple more words here from the end of the book. But I do think that this is at the heart of our identity crisis, that in many ways we could think about it coming down to two fundamentally contradictory visions of the country. One is this old vision, right, coming directly from the doctrine of discovery, from the Christian traditions that land here from Europe. And the question is basically this, right? Are we, this country, a divinely ordained promised land for, by, and of European Christians? Or are we a pluralistic democracy where everyone, regardless of race or religion, stands on equal footing before the Constitution? I think we have never fully answered that question. Right? These two visions have stayed with us in many ways and are still struggling with us today. In case you're still skeptical that that's still with us today, I'm going to leave you with one public opinion number here before I read a final section, and that's this: that we actually put the kind of core tenet belief of the doctrine of discovery on a public opinion survey last year that we did in partnership with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and we just literally asked, do you believe, do you agree, yes or no, that America was ordained by God to be a promised land for European Christians? We put it exactly like that on a public opinion survey. So the good news, I think, is that most Americans reject that premise, but 30% of Americans agree with that statement. However, there are two groups where a majority agree with that statement and are kind of, I think, interjecting it and amplifying it into our politics today. And those two groups are self-identified Republicans and white evangelical Protestants, the core kind of constituent group of that party. So that's part of why it's showing up in our politics with all kinds of claims that I can unpack later today. But I'm going to close with just a kind of short reading, again, from the end of the book that I think puts the questions to us as sharply as I can put it. So here's the question that must illuminate the path forward for us and our children. And here I'm talking directly to people who are white and Christian, kind of my people. How can we meaningfully respond to being beneficiaries of a crime so plain it cannot be denied, and so large it can never be fully righted? How could we meaningfully respond to being beneficiaries of a crime so plain it cannot be denied, and so large it can never be fully righted? It's easy to be overwhelmed by such a question. And even those conversations about restitution or reparations that get off the ground are quickly sandbagged by assertions about the impossibility of the task, or red herring objections to extreme solutions that no one has proposed. But if we're honest, we also know that the paralysis that often cripples discussions of justice is a defense mechanism stemming from a lack of real motivation. Up to this point in our history, the lesson seems to be this: while we are endlessly creative in fashioning novel ways to kill, dispossess, and defraud others, we are hopelessly unimaginative in our efforts to balance the scales of justice. Greed spawns a million schemes, while repentance throws up its hands. So this is a tall order, but I believe we cannot shrink before the difficulty of the task. The creativity of our solutions is directly proportional to and a measure of the strength of our convictions. Our better angels must energize us now as much as our worst have in the past. We white Christians no longer represent the majority of Americans. We're no longer capable of setting the nation's course by sheer cultural and political dominance. But there are still more than enough of us to decisively derail the future of democracy in America. If we wish to do otherwise, we can no longer disingenuously pretend that democracy and the doctrine of discovery are or ever were compatible. We can no longer pay tribute to one while benefiting from the other. We must choose. And if we choose democracy, it will require more than just confession by an unflinching few. It will require joining the work already underway to repair the damage done by this malignant cultural legacy. Through that transformative engagement, we might finally illuminate the path that leads to a shared American future.
Robbie, that was so powerful. And I want to thank you for framing it in such an insightful way. I mean, you spoke about America's identity crisis. And I want to get into my first question about your work. Your work to deepen our understanding of how Americans think about religion, justice, and oppression, and white supremacy has been highly acclaimed. There's no doubt about that. But what led you to this work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity? I mean, it sounds like you really dig getting into history. You could have been fine just doing the research for your own knowledge and edification, but why have you decided to write these 3 books and emphasize the importance of the topics that you're writing about?
Well, thank you for that question. I'll go back to that quote from Baldwin, right? That phrase has really stayed with me, the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. And I think this is something that I think, and I use this phrase, you may have heard me use this phrase, people who grew up thinking they were white, right? And I use that very intentionally because that's the way I've started to think about it, right? So in fact, through the wonders of Ancestry.com and DNA tests and all of that, what I should be saying is that I'm predominantly British and Welsh, right? That's really my ethnic background, right? But in America, right, I was just taught I'm white, right? That's who I was, right? And I think it's particularly, I mean, this happens all over Europe, but in America in particular, the kind of melting pot motif meant that whiteness was kind of this way of kind of identity cohering, but it's a lie, right? That's the thing about it, so I think it's a lie that leads to ill health, like ill mental health, and like a kind of crisis, I think. And so part of it has just been, I think it's the thing that many white people have missed, and white Christian people, I think in particularly, have missed, is that, yes, we should take up this work of racial justice because of it's a work of injustice, and we should be against injustice. But I think we often think it's a work of altruism. Right? There are other people who got wronged, and we should do something about that. But I think what we don't really grasp is how distorted it has made our own sense of reality, right? And how distorted it has made our own self-perceptions, what it means to be Christian, right? What it means to be a human being. Like, these things have all been deeply warped by white supremacy and these claims, right, of superiority that are deeply, deeply in us, right? They're in our liturgy, they are in our hymns, they are in our theology, and it's going to, it took 500 years to bake that stuff in. It's going to take a while for us to even like get a handle on it. The other thing I think is I don't like being lied to, right? And there was a point at which I was, motivated because I was angry. Like I was angry. I was angry that, I'll do one small example, but so I grew up I was born in 1968, and in 1976, I was in 3rd grade in Jackson Public School System in Jackson, Mississippi, when Jackson Public Schools finally got around to integrating our public schools, right? More than 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education, we finally got around to doing that at my elementary school. And there was a conspiracy of silence from every white adult in my life, right? Nobody explained, like, what was going on, why this sudden, like, our entire social world changed, right, overnight. And no one explained it because they didn't want to talk about the injustice, right, that led up to it. And I think that was kind of part of it. King also has this kind of indictment of predominantly, we're here in these kind of beautiful, this beautiful building, these beautiful stained glass windows. And he has this also in a letter from Birmingham jail, where he's looking at all the beautiful churches in Birmingham, and he's kind of in dismay because they're not standing up for the civil rights movement. And he says, you know, he writes there, like, who are these Christians and who is their God, right? Because they're nowhere on civil rights. And then he says this, he's diagnosing it, and he basically says these kind of, you know, white Christians are, instead of standing up for justice, his words are, they are sitting safely behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows. Right? Sitting safely behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows. And I can confess that, like, that is absolutely the role that my white Baptist church played in my life. Right? Rather than enlivening my conscience, it dulled it.
So on that note, I was doing a little research on you, preparing for this evening, and in honor of the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday recently, you reintroduced a column that you wrote years ago, apparently, emphasizing that white Christians need to read about the transformative power of Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, instead of focusing on comfortable quotes from the I Have a Dream speech in 1963. You said that white Christians and white Christian churches continue to function as arch defenders of the status quo. So from your perspective, why did you feel it was important and necessary to reiterate that column at this point in time in our history?
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. I think there has been many congregations, I think, like this one and others that are trying to lean in, trying to have, predominantly white congregations from predominantly white denominations that are trying to wrestle with these things. But there are plenty who are not, right? And even some that are doubling down and resisting it. And I guess if I could wave my magic wand with white Christian churches, I would forbid any readings from I Have a Dream. Right? And I would require readings from Letter from Birmingham Jail. Because there he has plenty to say to white Christians about their inability to stand up and live out their faith in a time when it really mattered.
So I want to go back to your Chicago connection for a moment, and I want to thank you for honoring Chicago's son, Emmett Till. What surprised you in your research about the events surrounding the Emmett Till murder?
Yeah, so in the book, I've given you kind of the theological structure to it, but there's 3 places that I kind of take a deep dive on. One is Emmett Till and the kind of Mississippi-Chicago story, and the other is the Tulsa Race Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then a third is one that I think has been under the radar, but a lynching that occurred in Duluth, Minnesota, right, way up north, and trying to tell those stories and to see how not only this kind of legacy of white supremacy and the doctrine of discovery affected and distorted these communities, but also how they're finding healing from this. So I'm from Mississippi, right? So part of that story of Emmett Till, of course, happens in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, where he's tortured and murdered. I think a couple of things stood out for me there. Is it sort of dawned on me to ask the question, like, how do we even get a community where someone could murder a 14-year-old boy for whistling at a white woman, right? Torture and murder a boy, and that's okay. And then that they could be taken to trial and acquitted in 67 minutes by a jury of all white men, and that's like okay. How do we even get there, right? So I think part of that story, I trake that story back and actually connect it all the way back to, I think I have a sentence in the book that says, Emmett Till was born in 1941, but his story begins 500 years earlier, right, with Hernando de Soto, right, and the kind of Spanish conquest of the area, and that leading up to, but if you have a society that's been built on genocide, violence toward Native Americans, forced displacement, enslavement, that act becomes a lot more intelligible, right, for it there. And so I think that was part of the context I was trying to build there. And just one little fact also stood out to me. Like everybody knows that, the jury was all white, all male. At the time, they were not seating women at all on juries. And they were selecting anyone on the voter rolls was eligible. So it's not only true there were only a jury of 12 white men that were selected, but the entire group that they were selected from was all white men, because there was not a single African American registered to vote in Tallahatchie County in 1955.
Because they couldn't.
Yeah, right, because of terrorism and lynching and all kinds of threats and all kinds of shenanigans to prevent people from being registered to vote.
Yeah. You wrote about other atrocities, specifically 2 historical atrocities that very few Americans were aware of until recently. And coincidentally, both of them took place in Oklahoma. There was the Tulsa Race Massacre, and then there was the Osage Indigenous Indian persecution and land removal. And we're just hearing about that. Yeah. Both incidents were rooted in racism and government policies that perpetuate white supremacy. So my question for you is, what role do you think we can play in advocating for more equitable policies and bring about social change and foster reconciliation when it comes to systemic racism?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I spend so much time on the doctrine of discovery is not just because it's an obscure theological doctrine from 500 years ago. It's because it's been instituted in U.S. law, right? In fact, one of the more stunning things is there was a case in 2005 that the ruling went against the Oneida Indians, who were trying to make claims for reincorporating some land into their reservation, and that Johnson v. McIntosh case was cited. The 1823 case that directly cites the doctrine of discovery was cited as footnote number 1 as a reason to deny their claims to reincorporate this land by none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? Footnote 1 there. So it's not just kind of the conservative justices, right? I mean, this is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right, making this argument. So this argument is still so with us today. It's there in more subtle ways sometimes, but I think bringing this thing and say, that we realize that the land claims that we have made are based on a theological assertion that it belongs to people who are white and Christian because they are superior to everyone else on the planet. Like that is the claim that an entire legal set of claims have been based on.
Okay, I want to pause and remind everyone that we welcome your questions, and the ushers have the question card, so the ushers could come forward and just raise your hand if you would like a card. Write your question down on the card, we'll collect them, and we'll address as many of your questions as possible. So, there was a troubling piece in the New York Times recently about how right-wing think tanks were strategizing in more activism against anti-racist policies, particularly in educational institutions. And the language of the drafters of these policies was blatantly racist, sexist, and homophobic. So this kind of ties into that earlier question about policies. How do we counter this growing resistance to creating diverse and compassionate societies?
Well, here's what I would say. It's important to note, I think that one of the reasons why we're seeing such a backlash about what do we teach our children about history, like history has become like a battleground, right? What do we, and this whole thing we haven't talked about, but the whole fight over the 1619 project, right? That just suggested that maybe we could start with a different origin story besides that. I used that little 1776 image, and that has a bunch of white men in their knickers with their quill pens standing awkwardly around, posed around a table in a painting, right, signing the Declaration of Independence. That's one way to tell the story of America, right? But if we back up and we tell the story that has Africans coming against their will to the U.S. As indentured servants to British colonies, that's a different a kind of American story. And I'm suggesting, too, that if we widen the lens even further back, because by 1619, there was more than a century of European interaction with indigenous people, right? That if we broaden the back, we'll tell another kind of American story. But I think it's a defense of this white Christian American story that we're seeing. So I would say that critical race theory, the fight on our librarians and our teachers, curriculum battles, school board battles, why? It's because there is power, right, in those Genesis stories. And people are fighting to kind of hold on to these older stories as these broader stories are coming. So I would say the good news in all of that is that it's a backlash, I think, to a changing country and to what I would say is some progress toward embracing pluralism. So it didn't come out of nowhere, right? It's a backlash, but that means it's a defensive movement to the winds of change. That's how I see it.
I'm glad you mentioned the 1619 project. Last year, Fourth Church hosted the creator of that book, the author, Nicole Hannah Jones. And in your book, it seemed there was a little tension there about her work, some things that you wrote in your book about her work. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So first, I just want to say, Nicole Hannah Jones, it's an amazing piece of work, right? And to think about what that project has accomplished, it is really, again, I grew up, I mentioned 1976, that was the bicentennial year, right? And so like those little dudes in Philadelphia, so there was the image of the country everywhere in 1976, the bicentennial year. But I think any piece of work that has changed an entire conversation is just amazing, right? And I think that's what the 1619 project has done. So I think what I've done in the book is to say a kind of yes and to the 1619 project is how I see it, like amazing work, and to dislodge 1776 is the only beginning point of an American story. I think huge work of cultural achievement. And then I think, yes, and we have to sort of like keep going back, right, to really get a full thing. The thing that's missing from that lens, again, is 100 years of European interaction with indigenous people. Mm-hmm. And so I just kind of want to back that lens up. If we're kind of thinking about what the 1619 project did was kind of bring the camera back so that we see not just those guys are over here now, right, and there's a much bigger frame. I think we just need to kind of take it back at least one more.
Thank you for explaining that wider view perspective, because in the book it wasn't quite clear, but it did feel like there was some tension there about your interpretation of her work. So thank you for clarifying. I want to go to a question about the media. When it comes to our current state of escalating news reports about censorship, about book bans, and the erasure of historical events that were designed to suppress the truth, basically, about America's history when it comes to white supremacy. So what are your thoughts about how we as Christians can take a more critical view to evaluate how information sources are being presented to us and how we can gain a more accurate understanding of history versus everything else that's being reported? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Here's the thing I'm continually flabbergasted about is that so many white Christians today, I think, seem so fearful about the truth, right? So, and it's worth asking, like, why is that, right? And of course, it's pretty obvious why that is, right? Because it challenges this mythology, right, of a different kind of self-serving American story where we white Christians are the center of it. But I think there's some amazing scholarship being done out there. I mean, we already talked about the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the other book. There are thinking about Kristen Copes DeMay, Jesus and John Wayne, Jamar Tisby's work, The Color of Compromise, a number of others. There's a lot of work being done to kind of unpack this and kind of give people a more critical view. But I think the thing is just having people like, we love to say, if we know the truth will set us free, right? But I think we got to live into, really live into that.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And a lot to choose when we're watching the news, right?
Yeah, I mean, social media is not, obviously not helpful, here.
Okay, see, we have a few questions from our guests this evening. And before I get to the questions, I want to ask a final question of you. What are the key lessons or lesson from the hidden roots of white supremacy that you would like the audience to leave with this evening?
Yeah, I think the thing is for us to do something, right? I remember, when Baldwin was often asked, like, so what do we do? How do we go forward? He often said, if I'm convinced of one thing, that we can be and do better. It sounds sort of simple, right? But that piece I read earlier about, it did hit me, when I looked at the ways in which kind of white Christian people, white Americans in general, all of the ways that we came up with, first, thinking about Native Americans, to defraud them of land, through all kinds of complicated schemes and gambits and legal mechanisms. And I mean, it was amazing, the creativity that went into that project of dispossession, right? Very similarly with African Americans, right? Not just enslavement, but even after enslavement, all of the kind of undoing Reconstruction, kind of going through, and like every time, even when like the process of redlining, right, reserving whites only parts of town, even when that was made illegal, then there were these neighborhood covenants that kind of popped up as kind of voluntary ways to kind of get around that law, like all of this kind of creativity again in the interest of white supremacy. And I think that again, kind of this, instead of this hand throwing up, it's like, no, let's like put our shoulder to the wheel. There's not going to be one kind of silver bullet answer here, but 1,000 responses, right, to address reparations, restitution, repair, these things. And it's not only, again, an act of justice, but it's an act of self-care, right, if you're white and Christian to do this.
Okay, that's a good segue to the first questions. How can Christians and non-believers better work together to combat Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so we haven't really mentioned Christian nationalism, but I mean, it's important to say, like, it's a new term that we have useful. It's a handle, I think, for describing a dynamic. But at the end of the day, Christian nationalism, I think, is in many ways just the new manifestation of this old doctrine of discovery, right? Made manifest in our politics. It has the same claims about who the country is of, by, and for, right? That are like at the root of it for now. So I think it's really important to remember, again, that when we look at national data, we did a study with Brookings that I mentioned earlier, and we found that it's about 3 in 10 Americans that qualify as either Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers. But that means that 2/3 of the country rejects that idea. And I think that's something to keep in mind, is that we actually are living on many of these critical issues, not in a 50-50 country. We're actually living in a 1/3, 2/3 country. But the way that our politics get driven through these two binary political parties, it looks more like a 50-50. thing, even when you look at the issues and it's not, right? So I think that's this kind of challenging thing for us to kind of remember. And so I think the kind of naming it is sort of one thing, and trying to find ways to resist these claims and name them, I think, for what they are, right? And they're fundamentally anti-democratic, right? The doctrine of discovery is anti-democratic. Like the claims of Christian nationalism that this is a Christian country is an anti-democratic claim, and we should keep naming it as such.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Robbie, what are your thoughts about federal reparations to formerly enslaved people as a viable option for repairing the harm of wealth theft over the centuries?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to do this at the federal level. I think we have to do it at the state level. I think we have to do it at the local level. So I think yes on all of that, right? Because the question is, who were the responsible entities, right? And there were responsibilities at all of those levels, right? So I think that's the important thing. You know, like in Oklahoma, for example, despite the fact that one of the initial reports issued by the city itself, the year after the Tulsa Race Massacre in the 20s, like it's on the record saying that Tulsa was responsible for this massacre, for not preventing it, and that they should repay all of that property loss to the last penny. Like it's in the record. And to this day, even after the reckoning that's happened there has not been 1 cent. And they're still surviving people, right? Not just descendants, but actual survivors who were kids. There's a handful of them left, and not them nor their families has seen any of that money. So I think yes at the local level, yes at the federal level. I don't have any great plan on how to do that, but again, we've figured out a lot of ways to make sure people didn't live in certain neighborhoods, to make sure that people didn't go to certain schools or on the basis of race. We can figure out how to repair it.
Mm-hmm. Well said. What words would you use to convince a Christian nationalist to think and vote differently from their previous view or position?
Yeah.
I'm from Virginia, it says.
Yeah, up in my neighborhood. Yeah, it's challenging. I think that what I found is arguments are not usually that helpful. As much as I love statistics, and that's what I have my day job, those usually aren't that helpful in those situations. What I think I've found is most helpful is stories and longer-term conversations, but stories, right? Here, and I think it's one of the things I've tried to do in my writing is to say, this is how I went from, stuffing letters for Trent Lott in college, right, as part of the Young Republicans outfit in Mississippi College, to where I am today, right? Here were the signposts for me along the way. Here's what happened. And to say, look, this is not, that journey was not despite my faith, right? That journey was because of my faith, right? That sort of led me down this road. So I think, in the world in which I grew up, we'd call that testifying, right? It's like giving your testimony. And I think that really makes it more human. It makes it invites another story, right? And then another story. And I think that's the way we're going to make. And I also want to say this, that local stuff makes a difference, right? I think up here on social media or whatever, is not going to move the needle. But
so what do you mean by local stuff?
Well, I mean, in Mississippi, this group that I kind of followed and wrote about was a group in Tallahatchie County. It's a very rural county. It's very poor. The county seat town has 600 some odd people in it. It's a very small place. And yet, this group of people, black and white, got together and decided we're going to try to tell. Well, first they just said, we just need to say we're sorry for what happened to Emmett Till. That was it. It wasn't any more sophisticated than that. They were this terrible thing happened here. We've never really acknowledged it, and we've never said we're sorry to the Till family. And that got enough people in a room that they then began to have these discussions. And it has led to, that discussion happened 20 years ago, and it has now led to, this big national thing now, this monument that's going to be a new national monument. Like, came from a discussion of 20 people in a courtroom basement in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, now is going to be the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument that's going to be jointly held in Chicago and in Tallahatchie County. Mm-hmm. So, I think those local conversations really matter.
Progress is slow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But there is progress being made.
Yeah, and white people walked out of those meetings. Like, it was not an easy thing, and people went after them and brought them back, and it was like that kind of thing going on. It wasn't an easy road. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Given the backlash against anti-racism work, what are some key things that can be done to establish civility with justice and healing?
Yeah, well, not to repeat myself, I do think one thing that storytelling does is it does kind of respect the humanity of somebody else on the other side, right? You're saying, this is a part of myself I want to share with you, right? I'm not going to tell you're dumb, tell you're racist to your face, like those kinds of things. I'm also want to say that I don't put civility above justice. So I think there are times when we have to be actually uncivil, right? To have the conversations that we need to have. There are hard conversations. And I think particularly for white Christians, one of our biggest sins is propriety. Now, I'm at a Presbyterian church, right? Everything in good order, right? But that sense of orderliness and propriety and politeness and things you don't do and things you don't talk about at the dinner table and like all of that, right, gets in the way of justice. And we're going to have to figure out some ways to be. I wrote a thing on my Substack newsletter called The Sacred Gift of White Discomfort, right? Because I think that's something we're not good at, right? We don't like it. And in some ways, we've grown up in a way to think like we shouldn't have to feel it. But I think in order to have these conversations, we're going to have to sit with it, right? And so I think there's a way in which civility is often an idol, I think, that kind of gets in the way of justice, and I want to kind of at least put it over here to the side. There's a way you can respect someone, even if the conversation, right, is really challenging, and somebody listening to it might not quite think it's civil.
Okay. The next question is, was the doctrine of discovery actually taught in our American seminaries? If yes, how? And if it was taught or is being taught, is it still being taught today?
Yeah, so I went through graduate school in the 90s, and I can tell you that it was not something I got, right? So it was really in writing this last book that, and I talk about that in the book actually, it's like, how did I take all these religious history classes and never really get this key set of things that really have come through the country? I picked it up from Vine Deloria Jr., like is where I encountered it. He's a Native American scholar, wrote this great book in 1969, right, called Custer Died for Your Sins. Amazing book. It's funny if you can. It's humorous and like devastating at the same time. But he wrote another book called God is Red. That was sort of in the 60s when Cone was writing God is Black, and so it's but this is something that like scholars of color have been writing about for 50 years, and in predominantly white institutions, it's just like nowhere, right? So I do think that is changing a bit, but like usually when I'm having this conversation with colleagues of mine who aren't white, they're like, yeah, doctrine of discovery, right? And when I'm talking to mostly white colleagues, they're like, huh? Like what? What is that? And so I think that is beginning to change. I'm hoping, I was just at a conference actually at Syracuse that was on the kind of doctrine of discovery and its legacies. But that's the first one of its kind that's ever been had, like one exactly on the doctrine of discovery.
Did you get the sense that it is something that is going to become more relevant in conversations and in teaching?
I think so. Yeah, I really do think it's something that'll become part of the vernacular. Is kind of what I'm hoping. I'm hoping to push that along a little bit.
Good.
Yeah.
I hope you do. I hope you do move that forward. Okay, next question. How does white Europe address some of these issues? I assume the U.S. is not alone with this evolution. Have they shown us any paths forward?
Yeah, so I was just at the American Cathedral in Paris in December, having a conversation like this one there. And of course, the version of this kind of dominant version of Christianity I've been describing, it came here from Europe, right? It landed on the shores from Europe. And, so all these kind of ways in which it seeped in came from Europe, whether it's a city set on a hill, right? Manifest destiny, like all these kind of ideas, but they're still struggling there, right? The same kind of anti-immigrant things that we were struggling with here. There's like Marine Le Pen in France is kind of gaining some following and digging in on kind of this, French nationalism, which kind of has a Christendom component to it, right? That's what authentically French, kind of a part of the story. So it's got its resonances there too, where they're not. I wouldn't say they're 20 miles down the road, and we can just kind of borrow a blueprint from them. It's still very much a challenge, I think, there too.
Okay. Let's see, what do we have next? You mentioned no black voters in 1956. Today, Florida and Georgia have removed over 100,000 black voters. Does history bend toward justice or toward fascism/racism?
Yeah, I have to say I'm not a believer in the arc of history bends toward justice. I think the arc of history bends, where we take it. And so I think it's our responsibility, if we don't want it to bend toward fascism, we should. And I should just be really clear about this. I've really not been really reluctant to use the word fascism in kind of my writing and public conversations. You won't find that in the book. But when I hear Donald Trump saying that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country, like there's no way to avoid the word fascism, right? It's literally straight out of Mein Kampf. Like I actually went and I wrote a whole piece on this, right? That those phrases and those words are right out of that. And if you unpack what that means, so what does it mean? There's a whole set of assumptions that have to, for a phrase like that to even make any sense, right? Poisoning the blood of our country. So what does that mean? Well, there has to be, first of all, a pure country that can be poisoned. So what kind of a pure country are we talking about, right? And it's pretty clear it is, because in other statements in the same month that he made that statement, he talked about banning immigrants who don't like our religion. So what's our religion, right? Well, of course, we don't have one, right? The Constitution guarantees it, but in his mind we do. In the minds of Christian nationalists, we do, right? So that pure country is this kind of white Christian America that's being protected, right? And the threat is that it's being poisoned by people who are not white and not Christian. That word, that kind of us and them mentality is indeed fascism, right? And so I think we have to kind of make that really clear. And for me, I'm trying not to kind of shy away from using that word now that we have like such a blatant example on the thing. I think that's really at stake in America today, and something we have to take quite seriously.
Okay. This is our final question.
All right.
One characteristic of white Christians, and I am one of them, is a focus on serving the less fortunate. How does this avoid the larger issue of systematic racism and economic inequality? And how can we move beyond serving as a faith community? And serving is in quotes.
Yeah, I think about, this makes me think about Frederick Douglass, his first autobiography in 1845, which, by the way, he penned the same year that the Southern Baptists broke from their Northern brethren over the issue of slavery, right? So my home denomination, founded in 1845 to make enslaving others on the basis of the color of their skin compatible with the gospel. That's the origin story of the Southern Baptist Convention. So that year, he writes his autobiography. And speaking of something else, I was assigned in school. So I was assigned to read his autobiography in college, but I was not assigned the appendix in college. And the appendix is his indictment of white Christianity at the end of his autobiography, and it's just devastating. Right? He goes on. He says, "The slave auctioneer's bell and the church bells ring together." Huh. And then he says, "We have had women and children sold to buy Bibles to send off to the heathen abroad." Right? And so the ways in which serving, missionizing, right, have been utterly compatible with white supremacy, I think is just mind-boggling. And in many ways, there's a compensatory factor to it, right? If we're serving others and we're doing stuff over there in Africa, right, then what does it matter? It kind of gets us off the hook for what we're actually doing here at home in many ways. I think that's the way missions, at least among Southern Baptists, I would safely say, often functions to kind of as a relief valve, right, for a kind of very troubled conscience about what's going on with racial relations, here at home. So, yeah, I think service has never quite gotten us out of this anesthetizing power of stained glass windows that King so eloquently talked about. And I think that's the real challenge. How do we get out of that box? And I think the real answer to that is that we've got to have relationships. I think that's been the key that I've seen, relationships across lines of race, across lines of ethnicity, and it's got to include, again, not just black and white, but the thing I've been also trying to bring to the fore is, there's been some energy around kind of crossing lines over between black and white Americans, but the other piece here is Native Americans, right? They've often been left out of that equation. And let me just kind of put it here we are, right? Chicago, Illinois, Michigan, the street we're on, right? All of these are indigenous words, right? That came from indigenous people. There's an Indian Boundary Park north of here, right? That park in Rogers Avenue was the boundary to keep Native Americans from living too close to the Chicago River. Right, so we've got to kind of bring that piece, I think, into the discussion here, and there are Native Americans here, right? Not just out in Oklahoma, right? But in Chicago, in Illinois, and I think kind of bringing that part of the conversation into play. But it's those relationships that make us, I think, us by white Christians, see something different than if we're all sitting around staring at each other, even if we want to be doing something good. So it's kind of an accountability and relationship.
Robbie, thank you so much for an engaging, insightful conversation this evening. You gave us a lot to think about. Leaving here, we can look for ways to form relationships, to tell meaningful stories in meaningful ways, and give more thought about just all that Robbie has enlightened us with, some things I learned in the book that I didn't know about. So I encourage you, if you did not get a copy of the book earlier, please order it online or visit your local bookstore. It's an amazing, well-written piece of history and very heart-touching. So thank you very much.
To continue some of this conversation, we've got a couple of small groups that will be meeting on Zoom. One will begin a week from tomorrow, February 8th. We'll meet at noon to 1 o'clock. Small group, if you would like to be part of that, you're invited. Another one will meet on Wednesdays for about 4 weeks. And that starts on, and that'll be from 5:30 to 7 in the evening, and that starts on February the 14th, which is an odd collision of days because it's Valentine's Day and Ash Wednesday, and that's just kind of odd to me that those both go the same day. But if you're interested in being part of those conversations, you're welcome, and the way to find out details and get connected are to send an email to Simon Crow at Fourth Church, and his email is scrow, S-C-R-O-W, at Fourth Church, spelled out, fourthchurch.org. And if you can't remember that, just call the church office and say, how do I find out about the small groups? And we'll connect you, all right? Thank you for being here tonight. We appreciate your presence, and you're always welcome. Go in peace. Go in peace.